She came to Colorado with one bag, one name, and zero illusions. The man waiting at the station took one look at her, and his face fell. He'd agreed to marry a woman through letters. He thought he understood what he was getting. He was wrong, not in the way he feared, in a way he wouldn't understand for months when a blizzard buried the mountains and every soul in that valley owed their life to the woman he almost turned away. This is the story of Marian Ashcroft, the woman nobody wanted, and the frontier she refused to break her. If this story moves you, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this has traveled. The train didn't slow gracefully into Millhaven Station. It groaned, shuddered, and released a long breath of steam like an animal exhausted from climbing too many mountains, which it was. The Rocky Mountain line had been eating locomotives for years, and the passengers who rode it learned quickly not to trust its schedule, its seats, or the wooden bridges it crossed without slowing down. Marian Ashcroft learned that in the first hour. She'd spent the rest of the 14-hour journey sitting straight-backed against the cracked leather seat, carpet bag wedged between her boots, watching Colorado rise around her through a window filmed with coal dust. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten since Missouri. She told herself it was because the food cart never came through her car, which was true. She didn't examine the other reasons too closely. She was 31 years old. She had $22 folded inside her left boot, a letter of introduction from the matrimonial correspondence office of St. Louis tucked into her coat pocket, and a face that strangers had been describing as sensible since she was 14, which she'd long ago understood was what people said when they couldn't think of anything kinder to offer. She wasn't beautiful. She'd made her peace with that sometime around age 19, when the third man she'd hoped might offer for her had instead married her younger sister, who was. What Marian had instead was this. She could run a household on nearly nothing. She could stretch a side of salt pork into meals for 8 days. She could read a ledger, spot a bad bargain, and fix 3 different things that most women were told required a man. She had a memory that held numbers the way other women held grudges, quietly, precisely, and for a very long time. She had sent all of this information carefully worded in her letters to Gideon Hale of Iron Crest, Colorado. He had written back. 4 letters spread across 2 months. His handwriting was poor, cramped and slanting, like a man who'd learned to write without anyone correcting him. But his sentences were direct. He needed a woman who could manage a working ranch house. He had 2 ranch hands and a cook who'd quit in July. The house was somewhat disorganized. He was 41. He had no patience for drama. She'd thought, I can work with this. What she had not thought about, not carefully enough, was the moment the train stopped and he was standing on the platform. She spotted him immediately through the dirty window. He wasn't hard to find. He was the only person standing still. Everyone else on that platform was moving, collecting, shouting. He stood apart from it with his hat in both hands, turning the brim slowly. Tall, wide through the shoulders in the way of men who'd done physical labor for 20 years and never stopped. Dark hair going to silver at the temples. A face that had been weathered past its age by wind and altitude. He was looking at the train car doors with an expression Marian couldn't entirely read from this distance. Expectation, maybe. Tension. She gathered her bag. She straightened her coat. She descended the iron steps of the rail car and placed both feet on Colorado soil. He saw her. She watched the change move across his face before he could stop it. It wasn't cruelty. She'd seen cruelty, and this wasn't that. It was something quieter and, in some ways, worse. It was a man recalculating. It was the look of someone who had built a picture in his mind from letters alone and was now standing in front of the reality, finding the two did not match. His hand stopped turning his hat. Marian kept walking toward him because there was nothing else to do. She stopped 2 feet away. Up close, his eyes were the particular shade of gray that Colorado skies turned in November. Not unfriendly, just prepared for winter. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Miss Ashcroft." His voice was low. He'd recovered, mostly. "You made it." The train was late getting through the canyon. Always is. A pause settled between them like a third person who hadn't introduced themselves yet. A woman with a baby on her hip pushed past carrying a trunk. The platform noise filled the silence without filling it. "I'll take your bag," he said finally. "I have it." He nodded once and turned toward the wagon. She followed. He didn't offer his arm. She didn't expect him to. The ride to Ironcrest took an hour and 40 minutes on a road that used the word road generously. Gideon drove. Marian sat beside him with her bag on her lap and watched the landscape open itself in every direction. Mountains behind them, valleys stretching ahead, the sky an unreasonable shade of blue that seemed almost aggressive after St. Louis gray. He didn't speak much. She didn't either. She'd learned long ago that silence between strangers was a test, and the worst thing you could do was fail it by filling it with noise just to prove you weren't uncomfortable. About 40 minutes in, he said, without looking at her, "The house needs work." "You mentioned it was disorganized." A breath that might have been a short laugh. That was being diplomatic. "All right. My last housekeeper left in March. Cook left in July. It's been—" He paused, seemed to decide against finishing whatever word he'd started. "It's been a difficult season." Marian looked at the side of his face, the jaw muscle working slightly, something he wasn't saying. "Was it just this season?" she asked carefully. Long pause, longer than the question warranted. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "The house has been difficult since then." There it was. "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it simply. She didn't add anything to it, didn't round it off or expand it into a sentiment, just left it where it landed. He nodded, eyes on the road. Neither of them spoke again until Ironcrest appeared around the bend. The town was smaller than she'd imagined. One main street, which was more of a dirt track with ambitions. A general store with a covered porch. A blacksmith. A church with a crooked weather vane. A saloon that looked busier than everything else combined. Maybe 40 buildings clustered together against the foot of the mountains like they were sheltering from something. A few people on the street looked up as the wagon passed. One woman, heavy-set, in a green dress standing outside the dry goods store, watched Marian with an expression of frank assessment, the kind of look that didn't try to hide itself. Marian met her eyes steadily, didn't smile, didn't look away. The woman's gaze flicked to Gideon, then back to Marian, and something shifted in her face. Not warmth, more like the particular expression of someone filing information away for later use. Marian had seen that look in 3 different states. She knew what it meant. It meant the town was watching. The ranch was 2 miles past the edge of town, tucked into a draw at the base of a long ridge. 3 buildings. The main house, a barn that had seen better decades, and a smaller structure she guessed was the bunkhouse. A split-rail fence that was losing its argument with gravity on the north end. A kitchen garden that had gone to dry stalks weeks ago, never cleared. A dog of uncertain breed and definite age came around the corner of the barn, regarded her without enthusiasm, and went back wherever it came from. 2 men appeared from the barn doorway. Both young, mid-20s maybe. One lean and dark-haired, the other broader with a sunburned face and the careful blankness of someone trying not to have a visible reaction. "Miss Ashcroft," Gideon said, stopping the wagon. "That's Cal Dreyer and Pete Marsh. My hands." Cal, the lean one, nodded. "Ma'am." Pete said nothing. He was staring at a point approximately 6 inches above her head, which she recognized as the technique of a man trying very hard not to stare at her face. She'd had 20 years of practice with this. She climbed down from the wagon before either of them thought to offer help, retrieved her bag, and said, "Good to meet you both. I'll need to know what you're short on in the barn by tomorrow morning, and I'll want to look at the kitchen tonight." Cal blinked. Pete blinked. Gideon said from behind her, "She means it." She was already walking toward the house. Come. The inside was worse than she'd let herself expect. Not filthy. Gideon Hale was not a filthy man, and she could see evidence throughout of attempts to manage things. Dishes stacked and washed, floors swept. But there was a particular kind of disorder that came not from laziness but from grief, from a person moving through rooms they no longer quite inhabited, keeping up with the minimum because the minimum was all they could manage. The kitchen was dysfunctional in the specific way of a room that had been organized by 3 different people with 3 different systems and then abandoned by all of them. Supplies were in the wrong places, duplicated where they shouldn't be, and missing where they should exist. The stove needed blacking. One of the pantry shelves had a soft spot in the wood she could feel when she pressed on it. Another month, and it would give way under weight. The main room had furniture placed with no logic she could identify, as if someone had moved it once and then moved it again and given up thinking about why. A coat rack by the far wall, 10 feet from the door it should serve, a lamp on the wrong side of the reading chair. The bedroom she'd presumably been given, she found it through a door off the main room, had a bed, a washstand, and a window that faced west, a braid rug on the floor. It was clean. Someone had put a clean cloth on the washstand. She set her carpet bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed for approximately 30 seconds. Then she got up, went back to the kitchen, lit the stove, and started taking inventory. Aha! Gideon found her there 2 hours later. She had a piece of paper in front of her covered in columns. What was in the pantry? What was near empty? What was spoiled and needed to go? What was duplicated uselessly? What was missing entirely? She'd moved the lamp from the main room to the kitchen while she worked and hadn't thought to ask. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she registered him. "There's no salt pork," she said without looking up, "and whoever was buying dried beans was buying the wrong kind. You've got 3 pounds of navy beans, but nothing to cook them with fast enough to be useful come deep winter. You want smaller beans. You want lentils." A pause. "All right. You're also paying too much for your lamp oil. I'd guess 15 cents per gallon above what you should be. Do you have the receipts from the Millhaven supply runs?" "Somewhere. I'll need them." He came into the kitchen and leaned against the far counter watching her. Not hostile, not warm either. Something she couldn't read yet. A man she was going to need to understand before she could work with him. "You hungry?" he said. "I was going to—" "I'll make something. Sit down." She looked up at him then. The offer surprised her. Not because she thought he was incapable of it, but because it was the first thing since the train platform that hadn't felt provisional. She sat. He made cornbread and warmed leftover beans over the stove with the quiet competence of a man who'd been feeding himself alone for a while. He set it in front of her without ceremony. "Thank you," she said. He sat across from her with his own plate. They ate. The only sound was the fire in the stove and the wind starting up outside, throwing itself against the side of the house. After a while, he said, "It was a fair amount of letters to send a woman, only to tell her the house was somewhat disorganized." "I've seen worse," Marian said. It was true. "You don't have to pretend." "I'm not pretending, Mr. Hale. I've seen worse." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not afraid of work. I told you that in my letters." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was doing something. She couldn't tell yet what it was. "You did," he said. He didn't say he believed it. He wasn't sure yet. She could see that. But he hadn't told her to leave either. That was enough for tonight. She was up before dawn. She found out later that Cal saw her kitchen light from the bunkhouse window at 4:30 and shook Pete awake to mention it. Pete, apparently, said something profane and went back to sleep. Cal watched the light for a while. That was how she learned that Cal Dreyer paid attention to things, which would matter later. She blacked the stove. She reorganized the pantry by function. Things used daily together. Things for preserving in one section, things for baking in another, with the worst of the soft shelf braced underneath with a split piece of firewood she found behind the stove. Not a repair. A temporary solution, clearly marked in her mind as something to fix properly before the shelf went out from under a full load. She moved the coat rack to beside the door. She pushed the reading chair to the correct side of the lamp. When Gideon came down at 5:30, she had coffee on and was mending a split in the kitchen window frame with a piece of felt she'd found in the rag pile, wedged in against the draft. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. "Coffee's there," she said, nodding toward the stove. He poured himself a cup. He looked at the pantry. She'd left the door open so the organization was visible. He looked at the coat rack. He looked at the window. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept 3 hours. It was enough." This was mostly true. He drank his coffee. She finished with the window frame. The draft stopped. You could hear the difference in how the room sounded, quieter on the north side. "What do you need?" he said finally. "I need those receipts, and I need to talk to Cal Dreyer about the barn supplies today." "I meant, do you need anything for yourself?" She straightened and looked at him, a little surprised. "I'm all right," she said. He nodded slowly, like he was filing her answer and not quite sure what to do with it yet. She thought, this is going to take time. She thought, that's fine. I have time. What she didn't know yet, what neither of them knew, was how much of that time would be spent not just rebuilding a house or a ranch, but learning to see each other as people rather than practical arrangements. And that this, too, was a kind of work. The hardest kind. The kind that couldn't be organized into columns or fixed with a piece of felt and a steady hand. But that was coming. For now, there was coffee in the pot and a long list of things that needed doing, and a woman who intended to do them. Outside, the Colorado sky was turning from black to a color with no good name. Not quite purple, not quite gray, something specific to high altitude and early morning that she'd never seen before. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at it for exactly 1 moment. Then she got back to work. The first week was the worst. Not because anything went catastrophically wrong. Nothing exploded, nothing collapsed. No one threw her out into the Colorado cold. It was worse than that, in the way quiet things are always worse. It was a week of being watched and found wanting by people who'd already decided their verdict before the evidence came in. She felt it most in town. Gideon needed supplies from Millhaven's general store on the 4th day, and he brought her along because she'd asked to see what they were paying for lamp oil. She'd been right about the price. She saw it on the invoice board the moment they walked in and had to work to keep her face neutral. 15 cents above the Pueblo rate. Maybe more. The store was run by a man named Odell Fitch, who was somewhere between 50 and 70 and had the particular quality of a man who had been the authority on something small for so long he'd forgotten there were things outside his expertise. He greeted Gideon with the easy familiarity of a long business relationship and turned to Marian with a smile that was technically present but did not reach anything above his chin. "So this is the new missus," he said. "Not yet," Marian said. "We're still in the arrangement period." Fitch's smile didn't change. "Well, Ironcrest is real glad to have you." He said it the way people say things they don't mean but have decided to say anyway because it costs them nothing. A woman appeared from behind a shelf of dry goods. The same heavy-set woman in the green dress Marian had seen on the street that first day. Up close, she was perhaps 55, with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone who had decided long ago that her opinions were a public service. "Ruth Payne," the woman said, extending her hand to Marian. Her handshake was brief and evaluating, like checking a melon at market. "I run the Women's Auxiliary. We organize the harvest gathering every October, among other things." "Nice to meet you," Marian said. Ruth Payne looked at her for a moment with that particular expression, not unkind exactly, more like a woman doing arithmetic. "Gideon didn't mention you were—" She paused, selected her word with visible care. "Practical looking." Marian held her gaze. "He mentioned the ranch needed managing. I am good at managing things." Ruth turned to Gideon. "She'll find winters here difficult. Most women from the east do." "I'm from Missouri," Marian said. "It gets cold." "Not like this." Ruth smiled the same smile Fitch had used. "But you'll learn." Marian bought the lamp oil from a supplier in Pueblo by mail the following week and saved Gideon $11 on the first order alone. She did not mention this to Ruth Payne. She mentioned it to Gideon, quietly, over the supply ledger after supper. He looked at the numbers for a long time without speaking. "That's not nothing," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "It's not." He didn't say anything else, but she noticed that after that, when she suggested something, he listened before he responded instead of after. That was something. The ranch hands were a different problem. Pete Marsh had settled into a kind of elaborately polite distance. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, ma'am," and did whatever she asked with the minimum friction possible while clearly believing, somewhere behind his eyes, that her presence here was a temporary condition that would resolve itself in time. He wasn't hostile. He was waiting. Cal Dreyer was harder to read. He was the one who'd watched her kitchen light from the bunkhouse window that first morning, and he watched her now the same way, attentively, without appearing to. He helped without being asked when she was carrying something heavy, but he did it casually, passing by, as if it had nothing to do with her. He answered questions directly, which she appreciated, and didn't add opinions she hadn't asked for, which she appreciated more. About 10 days in, she was in the barn checking what they had against what she needed to order before the winter supply routes got difficult, and Cal was repairing a bridle in the corner. They'd been in the same space for 20 minutes without speaking when he said, without looking up from the leather, Pete thinks you'll be gone by Christmas. Marian kept writing in her notebook. What do you think? A pause. He pulled the needle through. I think Pete's wrong about most things. She looked up at that. He was still focused on the bridle, but there was something around his mouth that wasn't quite a smile. Fair enough, she said. She went back to her inventory. That was the closest thing to an alliance she had for a while, and she didn't take it for granted. The work itself was the only thing she had full control over, so she focused there with the intensity of someone who understood that results were the only language skeptics actually listened to. She fixed the soft pantry shelf properly with lumber. She asked Cal to cut, mortised and braced, solid enough to hold through any reasonable load. She worked out a weekly meal rotation that stretched the ranch's food budget without making the food feel stretched. There was a difference, and she understood it between cooking poor and cooking smart. Pete Marsh, who she suspected had been quietly suffering through badly planned meals for months, ate 2 portions on the third Tuesday without commenting on it, which she counted as a significant victory. She started on the ranch's accounting in the second week. This was not something Gideon had asked her to do. He had not, in fact, asked her to do many of the things she did. He came home most evenings to find something reorganized, repaired, or improved that he hadn't known needed attention. He said little about it. She couldn't always tell if the silence was approval or something else. The account books were in a crate in the main room, which she only found by accident when she moved the crate to sweep behind it, and several loose papers slid out. She sat down with them after supper one night while Gideon was on the porch, and by 9 o'clock she had found 3 supply charges he'd been billed for twice in a row and 1 recurring expense that should have ended 6 months ago when the service it paid for stopped. She brought the ledger out to the porch. He was sitting in the wooden chair he always used, looking out at the dark ridge. He turned when the door opened. She held out the page with the figures marked. He took it, read it slowly, then read it again. The Millhaven freight account, she said. They kept charging after you stopped using them, and Morrison Feed billed you twice for September. I didn't... He stopped, rubbed his face with one hand. I haven't been... The books have been... You've been managing a working ranch without help, she said. Not unkindly, just as a fact. Things slip. He lowered the ledger slowly. In the thin porch light, she could see his jaw was tight. Not at her, she thought, but at himself. Men who prided themselves on competence did not enjoy discovering gaps in it. How much? He asked. Recoverable? About $43 if you write to Morrison this week and the freight company by month's end. He was quiet for a long time. $43 was not nothing, not on a ranch that had been running short for years. I'll write them, he said. She nodded and turned to go back inside. Marian, she stopped. It was the first time he'd used her first name since the train platform. Thank you, he said, still looking out at the dark. Said it stiffly, like a man who didn't use those words often enough to make them easy. It needed doing, she said, and went inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed, hands still. Something in her chest was doing something unfamiliar, not quite warmth, more like a door in a cold room opening slightly toward a room where there might be a fire. She didn't know what to do with it, so she put it away and went to bed. 3 weeks became a month. The house was different now in ways that were hard to point to specifically, but impossible to miss if you'd seen it before. It was still not a beautiful house. That would have required money they didn't have and time she hadn't finished earning yet. But it functioned. The kitchen worked the way a kitchen was supposed to work. The draft from the north window was gone. The pantry held winter supplies organized so that anyone could find anything in 30 seconds, and the inventory list she kept on a nail inside the pantry door matched what was actually there because she updated it every time something came out or went in. The ranch hand's meals were reliable and filling. Gideon's accounts were organized. The recurring financial bleeding had been stopped. But outside the ranch, nothing had changed. Ironcrest had decided what it thought about Marian Ashcroft sometime in the first week, and small frontier towns were not, as a rule, quick to revise their first impressions. She heard things through the ordinary channels. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. It was simply that people said things near her without appearing to think she would remember them, which was a mistake people often made. In the dry goods store, two women discussing the harvest gathering paused and lowered their voices when Marian walked by. Not low enough. She caught Gideon Hale's sense, sending away for something like that. And then a murmured response she didn't catch, and then a laugh, quiet and knowing. She kept walking. Outside the blacksmith's one afternoon, a man she didn't know said to another man she did, "Must be desperate times up at the Hale place." The other man looked uncomfortable. He'd seen Marian around the corner first. The first man turned and had the decency to look embarrassed at least. She nodded to both of them and continued on. The woman who bothered her most was Ruth Payne, because Ruth Payne had influence in Ironcrest of the particular kind that belongs to women who have organized things for long enough that people have forgotten what things looked like before they organized them. She ran the women's auxiliary, yes, but she also ran the harvest gathering, the winter clothing drive, the informal network of information that connected every household in the valley. What Ruth Payne said about a person traveled, and what Ruth Payne said about Marian, from what Marian could piece together, was something along the lines of, "Poor Gideon. He didn't know what he was getting." Marian knew this not because anyone told her directly, but because of the particular way several women in town spoke to her. Carefully, with an undertone of sympathy they didn't bother to fully conceal, as if she were a situation that needed to be handled gently rather than a person to be spoken to normally. She was tired of it. She would not pretend otherwise. The tiredness was different from hurt. She'd had enough practice with this variety of dismissal that it no longer cut clean. It was more like carrying something heavy over a long distance. You could do it. You just noticed the weight. What she didn't do was say any of this to Gideon. She thought about it once, toward the end of the first month, when they were both in the kitchen after supper and the conversation had loosened enough between them that it felt possible. He'd started talking more over meals, not volubly, not warmly, but more, asking about her decisions, explaining why he'd done things a certain way on the ranch. She'd begun to understand the rhythm of how his mind worked, which was methodical and slower than her own, and not less intelligent for it. She'd started to say something about what she heard in town, about Ruth Payne, and then stopped. Because saying it would make her sound like she needed something from him, like she needed defending, and she did not want to need defending. She wanted to make it irrelevant. So she filed it away, and 3 days later the thing happened with the harvest gathering. The woman who organized it every year, a capable, energetic woman named Dolores Hartman, who had been running the event for 8 years without apparent difficulty, fell from a ladder while putting up her storm shutters in mid-September and broke her collarbone in 2 places. She'd be in a sling for 6 weeks, minimum. The harvest gathering was in 5. This was, in frontier terms, a genuine crisis. The harvest gathering was not optional recreation. It was the single annual event that brought 30-odd families and 3 surrounding settlements together to share resources, trade goods, plan cooperative winter provisions, and conduct the ordinary social business that kept isolated communities from fragmenting entirely. Canceling it was not a realistic option. Marian heard about Dolores's injury from Cal, who heard it from the blacksmith, who heard it from the doctor. She sat with it for 2 days. Then, without telling Gideon first, she walked into town and presented herself at the door of the women's auxiliary meeting that Ruth Payne convened on the subject. The meeting was in Ruth's front parlor. 6 women, sitting in the particular arrangement of a group that has been having the same meetings for years and has assigned seating without ever discussing it. They looked up when Marian appeared in the doorway. Ruth's expression did not change, which Marian had learned meant she was thinking quickly. "Mrs. Hale isn't with us yet," one of the younger women said helpfully. Her name was Agnes Toll, and she had not yet been in Ironcrest long enough to have decided about Marian in either direction, which made her the most comfortable person in the room. "Miss Ashcroft," Marian corrected. "We haven't married yet." She came in and stood because there was no available chair and no one moved to provide one. "I heard about Dolores. I'm sorry. I understand the gathering doesn't have an organizer." "We're discussing options," Ruth said. "I'd like to organize it." The silence had a specific texture. 5 of the 6 women looked at Ruth. Agnes looked at Marian. "That's generous," Ruth said carefully, "but the harvest gathering is a considerable undertaking. You haven't been in Ironcrest long enough to—" "I know that." Marian kept her voice level. "I don't know these families or their histories or what worked poorly in previous years. I'd need help with that. That's why I came to this meeting instead of starting on my own." She looked around the room steadily. I'm asking for your knowledge of this community, and I'm offering to manage the planning and execution. That's the arrangement I'm proposing. Another silence. Agnes said, She reorganized the Hale Ranch. I heard the accounts were a disaster and she fixed them in a week. Agnes, said another woman, I'm just saying what I heard. Ruth looked at Marian for a long time. Marian did not look away. Dolores keeps her notes in a green ledger, Ruth said finally. I'll send someone for it today. Marian rode back to the ranch with the green ledger under her arm and an arrangement that was technically a vote of confidence and functionally a test. She understood this. She was not naive about it. The town was giving her just enough rope, and the question was what she would do with it. She spent that evening reading Dolores Hartman's notes with the focused attention she brought to anything that mattered. The woman was organized, thorough records going back 4 years, detailed lists of what was needed, who supplied what, which families brought food and which needed to receive it, without the transaction being made obvious because their pride required the discretion. That last detail told Marian something important about how Dolores understood her community, which was with a kind of careful respect that Marian recognized and intended to honor. Gideon found her at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock with papers spread in 3 directions and a cup of coffee she'd forgotten to drink. What's all this? He said. She told him about the gathering, about Dolores, about the meeting at Ruth Payne's. He listened with his arms crossed, and the expression she'd come to identify as him thinking through the implications of something. Ruth agreed to let you run it? Provisionally. Ruth doesn't do anything provisionally. She did this time. Marian looked down at the ledger. I think she's expecting me to fail. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. What do you need? He said. The same question he'd asked her on that first bleary morning when she'd fixed the window draft and refused to admit she was exhausted. Only this time it landed differently. She looked at him across the table, the lamp between them, papers and calculations everywhere, 2 people who had been circling each other carefully for a month, and something in her softened slightly. Not enough to be visible, she hoped, but enough that she felt it. I need someone to ride out to the Calloway homestead and the 3 families past Miller's Creek, she said. They're the most isolated. I want to know what they can contribute and what they actually need without making it feel like a survey. Do you know them well enough? Known the Calloways 15 years, he said. Good. She pushed a piece of paper across the table. These are the questions I need answered. You don't have to ask them exactly like that. Just come back with the information. He picked up the paper, looked at it, looked at her. You already know what you're doing, don't you? He said. Not a question exactly. I know how to organize things, she said. That's not the same as knowing people. That's what I need you for. He looked at the paper again. Something was moving across his face that she couldn't name. Something between surprise and a longer, slower recognition. Like a man who'd been looking at a thing close up for a long time and had just taken a step back to see what it actually was. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. I'll write out Thursday, he said. Thank you. He stood and then paused. You know, most of the town thinks you're going to fall apart at the seams with this. I know. That doesn't bother you? She considered that honestly for a moment. The tiredness of carrying the weight came back to her briefly. Ruth Payne's careful sympathy, the man outside the blacksmith's, Pete Marsh waiting patiently for her to give up and leave. It bothers me less than failing would, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once. A single, deliberate nod. The kind that meant something specific from a man who didn't move carelessly, and went to bed. Marian sat alone at the kitchen table for another hour. She made 7 lists before she was satisfied. She went through Dolores's notes a second time. She mapped out the week before the gathering in hours, not days, because days were too large a unit when you were trying to prevent anything from falling through the gaps. Outside, the Colorado night was enormous and cold and indifferent. The wind found the places in the house where it could still get in and made itself known there. She didn't notice. She was working. 5 weeks later, the harvest gathering was the best Ironcrest had seen in a decade, and Marian had no idea that a blizzard was coming that would make everything she'd done before it look like rehearsal. But that was still ahead of her. For now, she sharpened her pencil, turned to the next page, and kept planning. The harvest gathering came together the way Marian's best work always did. Not elegantly, not without friction, but with the kind of stubborn, functional precision that meant when you stood back at the end and looked at it, everything was where it needed to be. The week before, she had driven herself and everyone around her harder than was comfortable. Cal had stopped making any expression at all when she handed him a new list, which she took as a sign of either profound respect or profound resignation, and decided not to investigate which. Pete Marsh, who'd spent 2 months waiting for her to prove him right, had somewhere in the middle of the third week of preparation quietly stopped waiting and started helping. Not enthusiastically, not with any visible change in his face, but she'd come home one evening to find he'd repaired the wagon wheel she'd mentioned offhand that morning without being asked, and she'd said nothing about it except thank you, and he'd said yep, and that was that. Gideon had ridden out to the Calloway place and the three families passed Miller's Creek and come back with exactly the information she'd needed, organized in the same format she'd given him, which told her he'd paid attention to her system rather than substituting his own. That mattered. He'd also come back with something she hadn't asked for. He'd talked to old Warren Calloway for 2 hours over coffee and learned that the Calloways had a surplus of smoked venison they'd been unable to trade because their wagon axle had cracked in September and they hadn't been able to get to town. He arranged the pickup himself without telling her he was going to, and showed up 3 days before the gathering with 4 wrapped packages in the wagon bed. She'd stood in the yard looking at them. Calloway says it's the least they can do, Gideon said, climbing down. He sounded like he meant it. You didn't have to do that. I know. He carried the first package toward the house. I wanted to. She watched his back for a moment. Then she picked up a package and followed him. Ruth Payne arrived at the church hall on the morning of the gathering with her jaw set in the expression of a woman prepared to manage a disaster gracefully, which was the most generous possible interpretation of her expectations. What she found instead was a hall that had been set up with a logic she had to spend 5 minutes studying before she understood it. Tables arranged not in the traditional long rows but in a pattern that created natural gathering spaces while keeping the food distribution area clear and accessible from 3 sides, so that the families who needed to take more than they brought could do so without standing in a line that made the transaction visible to everyone else. That had been Marian's idea, derived from something she'd noticed in Dolores Hartman's notes. A small asterisk next to 3 family names and the word discretion underlined twice. She'd understood immediately what Dolores had meant and had designed the layout around it. Ruth stood in the middle of the hall for a long moment. Then she turned to find Marian and said without preamble, "The Morrison family will need to take from the surplus without it being obvious. I wasn't sure you'd know that." "I know," Marian said. Ruth looked at her. Something shifted in the older woman's face. Not warmth, not yet, but a recalibration. The arithmetic she'd been doing about Marian for 2 months came up with a different answer, and she didn't entirely like it. Not because the answer was bad, but because it meant she'd been wrong, and Ruth Payne did not enjoy being wrong. "The table arrangement is sensible," she said finally. "Dolores's notes were good," Marian said. "I followed her logic where I could." It was the right thing to say. Ruth's expression shifted again, something softening slightly at the mention of Dolores. "She'll want a full accounting when her collarbone heals." "I'll write one for her." Ruth nodded once and went to find Agnes Toll, and Marian went back to making sure the fire in the hall's stove was burning correctly, because the hall was large and the temperature outside was dropping, and she'd calculated they'd need it at 3/4 capacity to keep the space warm through the evening. The families began arriving around noon. By mid-afternoon, the hall was full in the good way. The noise of people who don't see each other often and have things to say. The particular volume of children who've been in wagons since morning and need to spend their energy somewhere. Marian moved through it all with the focused attention of someone running a complex operation, which she was, while managing to look to most observers like she was simply present. She watched the food tables to make sure the balance stayed right. She watched the Morrison family come in and find their way to the surplus table without a moment of awkward visibility, because she'd positioned Agnes Toll there specifically and briefed her that morning on how to manage the exchange with the matter-of-fact ease that stripped it of any possible humiliation. She watched Gideon. He was across the hall talking to the Calloway men, laughing at something Warren said, more relaxed than she'd seen him in the 8 weeks she'd known him. He had a different quality in a room full of people he'd known for years. Not warmer exactly. He wasn't a warm man in the conventional sense, but looser, less contained. She found herself watching him for longer than she intended, and looked away. Cal appeared at her elbow. "You eating?" he said. "Later. You said that 2 hours ago." She looked at him. He was holding a plate with a portion of the smoked venison and 2 biscuits on it. "Cal, I'm just setting this down here," he said, placing it on the edge of the nearest table. "On account of it needing somewhere to be." He walked away. She ate the venison and both biscuits standing up, watching the room. It was around 4 o'clock, while the afternoon light was still coming through the hall's high windows, that she first noticed it. She'd stepped outside for 10 minutes to check on the wagon team. The horses had been standing a long while, and she wanted to make sure they'd been watered, and she stopped 3 steps out the door. The air had changed. It was not a dramatic change. She couldn't have explained to anyone exactly what she was responding to, not in words that would have meant anything to someone who hadn't spent years reading weather the way some people read faces. But something in the quality of the cold was different from an hour ago. The wind, which had been coming steadily from the northwest all day, had dropped in a way that wasn't calm. It was the particular quiet of a pressure change, the atmosphere rearranging itself in preparation for something significant. She looked up at the ridge to the north. The peaks had been clear this morning. They were not clear now. A wall of cloud sat on them, low and thick and moving, not fast, but with the unhurried certainty of weather that doesn't need to hurry because it's going to arrive regardless. She stood there for longer than she'd meant to. The cloud wall was still some distance away. Hours, maybe. Maybe more. But the temperature was dropping faster than it should have been for the time of day. She could feel it on her face and hands, a cold that had teeth in it now, where before it had only had presence. She went back inside. She found Gideon first. He was still with the Callaways. She touched his arm. She'd never done that before. Touched him first, and she felt him register the slight surprise of it, and said quietly, "Can I have a moment?" They stepped to the edge of the room. She told him what she'd seen and what she felt about the air. He looked at her with an expression that was neither dismissal nor immediate agreement, a man taking in information and working it. "How long do you think?" "I don't know, 4 hours maybe 6. But the families from Miller's Creek, that's a 2-hour ride in good conditions. In a blizzard, it's not passable at all." "That's what I'm saying." He was quiet for 5 seconds. Then, "I trust your read on this. What do you want to do?" Something tightened in her chest. Not fear, something more specific. The weight of being the person with the opinion that would decide things. "I think we keep everyone here," she said. "Tonight. We turn the gathering into a shelter situation, and we don't let anyone start for home before morning, when we can see what we're dealing with. Half these people won't want to hear that. Livestock to tend, animals left unsecured." "I know." She met his eyes. "But if I'm right about this storm, the families from Miller's Creek won't make it home. The canyon road floods when the snowmelt comes fast and it drifts 8 feet in a mountain blow. I've been reading Dolores's notes. She wrote about it. The bad winter of '79. 3 families stranded on that road." Gideon looked across the room. She could see him running calculations of a different kind from hers. Social ones, the weight of asking people to give up their plans and trust a woman most of them thought was still on trial in this valley. "You tell them," he said. "Not me." She blinked. "What?" "This is your call, Marian. You tell them." He said it without challenge, without maneuvering, just a clear, direct thing. "I'll back you up, but you tell them." She looked at him for a moment. Then she straightened, turned around, and walked to the center of the hall. She didn't raise her voice to get the room's attention. She picked up a metal ladle from the nearest table and hit the side of the iron stove with it 3 times. The sound cut through the noise like a physical thing. Heads turned. "I need everyone to listen for a minute," she said, into the silence that followed. Her voice was steady. She'd made it steady through an act of will she would feel later, in her hands, but right now her hands were still. "There's a storm coming off the North Ridge. I've seen the signs this last hour, and they're not good. I'm asking everyone who came more than 90 minutes from town to stay here tonight instead of making for home." The room was quiet. Then it wasn't. The objections came from 6 directions at once. Livestock, families. Left the barn door open this morning. Can't sleep in a church hall with children. Who does she think she is to say? She let it run for about 20 seconds. Then she said, not louder, but with a different quality, The canyon road to Miller's Creek drifted 8 feet in the winter of '79. 3 families were stranded for 4 days. 2 horses died. That's documented. She paused. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I see and asking you to consider it. But I'm going to start preparing this hall as an overnight shelter now, and anyone who wants to help is welcome. She turned to Agnes Toll, who was watching her with wide eyes. Agnes, I need to know what food is left on the tables and what's in the storage room behind the kitchen. Can you find that out for me in the next 10 minutes? Agnes nodded immediately and went. She turned to Cal, who'd materialized somewhere to her left. I need the stove at full capacity. More wood if there's any in the outbuilding. There's a cord stacked out back, Cal said, and was moving before she finished nodding. Gideon had stepped to her right. He said, quietly, Warren Calloway's going to try to leave. His wife is alone at the homestead. I know. She'd already thought about this. That's the first ride you need to make, to the Calloway place, to get Margaret and bring her back here before the pass closes. Can you take 2 men and go now? Now? If you wait another hour, I don't know if the North Pass is manageable. He looked at her for one long second, the look that had been building and changing over 8 weeks, something in it that she still didn't have a word for, something that had gotten quieter and deeper as the weeks went on. All right, he said. He raised his voice across the room. Pete, Jimmy Falk, get your horses. We're riding to the Calloway place. Pete Marsh, who had been standing near the door with his coat on, pulled it tighter and went without a question asked. She registered that. She registered what it meant that Pete didn't ask. Ruth Payne appeared beside her as Gideon went out the door. Marian braced herself. But Ruth said, The storage room has 2 wool blankets and a canvas tarp, not enough for 30 people. Every family that came by wagon should have a blanket on their rig, Marian said. Can you organize collecting them? 1 per wagon, they keep the second for their own family. Ruth was already turning. Agnes, she called, come with me. The room had split in the way of groups in a crisis, a portion still deciding, still hovering at the edge of objection, and a portion that had shifted into action because someone with a clear head was pointing in a direction. Marian worked the boundary between those 2 groups for the next hour, neither arguing nor dismissing, simply answering questions as they came, providing specifics where specifics were what people needed, and when the first gust of real wind hit the north wall of the church hall and the lamps swayed in their brackets, the decision made itself. The storm arrived faster than she'd estimated. By 6 o'clock it was fully dark, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees and the snow was moving horizontal, the kind of horizontal that meant you couldn't see the building you were standing next to from 10 feet away. 2 men who'd left in the first wave of departures came back an hour later, hats coated white, faces gray with cold. And the younger one, a farmhand named Denny Oakes, 19 years old, with the look of someone who'd just learned something important about weather and pride, said nothing to Marian when she handed him a blanket and pointed him toward the stove. He just took it. That was enough. Inside the hall, she'd organized it in layers. The stove at full capacity with 2 trusted people rotating the wood so it never dropped. The food she'd had Agnes inventory divided into a rational rationing system, enough for a full day if they needed it, which she hoped they wouldn't, but planned for anyway. The sleeping spaces divided by family unit, organized to give the families with young children the warmest positions closest to the stove. An area near the back where she'd set up a changing space using the canvas tarp, for mothers with infants and for anyone who needed privacy. She'd put Mrs. Hartley, an older woman who'd been coming to this gathering for 20 years and had the trust of the room in the way of people who've simply been present long enough, in charge of the children's section. Not because Mrs. Hartley was the most capable person there, but because she was the person the children's mothers trusted most, and in a frightened room that was worth more than capability alone. Marian understood that difference because she'd spent a long time learning it the hard way. The frightened room was real. Around 7 o'clock, when the wind found something in the building's structure that made it produce a low, sustained moan, a woman named Clara Fisk started crying. Not quietly. The way people cry when they've been holding something for too long and the wrong sound breaks it open. Her husband put his arm around her and looked helpless, which husbands in that situation often do. Marian sat down next to Clara Fisk on the floor with her back against the wall, the way the other people in this section of the hall were sitting, and said, "Your place is east of town?" Clara, mid-cry, managed, "Yes." East of town, the wind runs along the valley floor. It doesn't drift the same way it does in the hills. Your barn will be all right." This was partially informed speculation, and Marian knew it. But she also knew that Clara Fisk's barn, being east and low, genuinely was at less risk than the hill properties, and she knew that Clara needed a truth, not a performance of reassurance. A partial truth delivered directly was better than a complete comfort delivered vaguely. Clara's crying slowed. "You don't know that," she said. "I know the geography," Marian said, "and I know you're safer in here than on the road. Both of those things I'm certain about." Clara looked at her with the naked, exhausted expression of someone who wanted to believe something and needed it to be real. "Are you always this calm?" Marian thought about that. "No," she said honestly, "but right now I need to be, so I am." Clara let out a long breath and leaned her head back against the wall. Her husband caught Marian's eye over his wife's head and gave her a look she would think about later. A look that had several things in it at once, none of which he had words for in that moment. At 8:30, the door blew open. Not from the wind. It was pulled from outside by a hand that had to fight the pressure to do it. Gideon came through first, snow covering him from hat to boots, ice in his beard, breathing hard. Behind him came Pete and Jimmy Falk, and between them, wrapped in 2 horse blankets, was Margaret Calloway, 72 years old, who had been alone at the Calloway homestead when they arrived and had apparently refused to leave until Warren came and stood in front of her, at which point she'd said, "Well, why didn't you just say so?" and walked out to the horses. Warren Calloway, who'd been sitting by the wall worrying visibly for 3 hours, crossed the room in 6 long steps and had both arms around his wife before she'd fully cleared the doorway. She said something to him quietly. He said something back. He was shaking slightly. Marian had a blanket and a hot cup from the coffee pot on the stove in front of Margaret Calloway within 2 minutes. Margaret took both, looked at Marian, and said, "You're the Ashcroft woman." "Yes, ma'am. Warren says you organized all this." Marian glanced across the hall. 30-some people, children asleep or nearly, adults in various states of tired and worried but present, warm, fed, the stove burning steady, the food supply intact. No one had panicked. No one had done anything they couldn't come back from. "A lot of people helped," she said. Margaret Calloway looked at her with the thorough attention of a woman who'd been reading people for 7 decades and knew what she was looking at. She said, in a way that was not agreement exactly, but was something close. Gideon came to Marian's side. He'd gotten the snow off, but his coat was still damp and his face was raw from the wind. He stood close enough that she could feel the cold coming off him in waves. 3 families in the South Draw couldn't make it to the hall, he said, low. They turned back to the Fenner place. It's close enough from there. How do you know? We crossed Len Fenner on the road. He was going to collect them. She let out a breath she'd been holding for some time. Okay. He looked at the room, then at her. He had snow melt on his eyelashes. He looked exhausted and something else she didn't let herself name. You were right about the storm, he said. I know. You were right about the road. I know that too. A pause. The wind moaned in the roof. A child on the other side of the room shifted in sleep and made a small sound and settled. How did you know? He asked. About the weather. She thought about how to answer that. You learn to watch things, she said. When you don't have much else to rely on, you watch things very closely. The way the cold feels, the way the light changes. After a while, you stop needing someone to tell you. She paused. Or you stop waiting for someone to believe you. He heard that last part. She could tell because of what happened in his face. A slow, quiet thing, like ice in a river beginning to shift, the whole mass moving imperceptibly but moving. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, is there anything left that needs doing tonight? She looked around the room. Agnes was managing the food section. Ruth Payne had taken over the children's area from Mrs. Hartley an hour ago without being asked, and was doing it with a methodical competence that Marian would not forget. Cal was at the stove. Pete had found his way to the older men by the east wall and was, of all things, playing a slow card game that seemed to be functioning as a general anxiety management exercise for everyone involved. No, she said. I think we're all right. He nodded. He didn't move away. Marian, he said. Yes. He looked at her with the Colorado winter in his eyes, and the hard weeks in his face, and something else that had been building since October, since a woman with a carpet bag and no illusions had gotten off a train and walked toward him when every reasonable instinct probably said to get back on. "I'm glad you came," he said. She looked at him. In the stove-lit room, with the storm outside and 30-odd people sleeping or sitting in the valley she'd helped hold together tonight, she felt the door she'd kept carefully shut for most of her adult life open a little further. Not all the way? Not yet. But further than before. "So am I," she said. Outside, the blizzard buried Iron Crest in 4 feet of snow before dawn. Inside the church hall, not one person was on the road when it happened. Every family accounted for, every child asleep by 10. The stove burned through to morning, and in that hall, something shifted in the way this valley understood the woman who'd been among them for 8 weeks. The woman nobody had wanted, who just made herself impossible to dismiss. The morning after the blizzard was the kind of quiet that only comes after something loud has finished with you. The snow had stopped around 4 in the morning. By the time the first gray light came through the high windows of the church hall, the wind had dropped to almost nothing, and Iron Crest lay under 4 feet of white that softened every edge and muffled every sound, and made the world look briefly like something that had never caused anyone any trouble at all. It was the kind of morning that fooled you, if you let it. Marian had slept perhaps 2 hours on the floor near the stove, her coat folded under her head, and woke with the particular alertness of someone whose body had learned not to waste time on the slow transition out of sleep. She was up and checking the food supply before most of the hall had stirred. The stove needed more wood. She added it herself rather than waking Cal, who was asleep against the wall with his hat over his face and had earned the rest. The room woke slowly, the way people do when they've slept badly in an unfamiliar place. Children first, with the animal energy of young bodies that don't carry yesterday's fear into the morning the way adults do. And then the adults in stages, sitting up and looking around and remembering where they were and why. Gideon was already awake. He'd been awake for a while, she could tell from the way he was sitting, not the posture of someone who just opened his eyes, but the settled stillness of a man who'd been thinking in the dark for some time. He was near the door with a cup of coffee she hadn't seen him pour, looking at nothing in particular. She brought her own cup and sat in the chair nearest him, which was technically Mrs. Fenner's chair, but Mrs. Fenner was still asleep. "How deep do you think?" she said. 4 feet in the valley, more in the draws." He looked at the door. "The Millers Creek Road is going to be buried for at least a week." She absorbed this. A week meant the families from that direction couldn't get home, couldn't tend their livestock, couldn't manage their properties. Who has animals that can't wait a week? He thought about it. The Oaks boy. He's got a milk cow with a calf coming before month's end. And the Brower family keeps sheep. You lose sheep fast in a cold snap if the barn's not secured. "Can you and Pete ride out this morning?" Was already thinking it. He looked at her sideways. There was something in his face this morning that was different from last night. Something that had settled rather than burned. The rawness was still there. She could see it around his eyes, the evidence of a hard ride in bad weather and a night of too little sleep. But underneath it was something quieter, more certain. "You? I need to stay here until everyone gets sorted for the road. Make sure the families know what they're going back to and what they should check first." She paused. "And I need to talk to Ruth." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "About what?" "About something I've been thinking about since September." She didn't explain further, and he didn't push. That was something she'd come to appreciate about him in the past 8 weeks. The man understood that not everything needed to be drawn out in conversation before it was ready. The hall came to full life around 7. Marian organized breakfast from what remained of last night's supply, which was enough if not generous, and made sure the families who'd come with less ate the same as everyone else, without any of the arithmetic being visible. She'd gotten good at that particular management over the years. The redistribution that didn't look like redistribution, the evening out of resources in a room full of people whose pride was as real as their hunger. The Calloway family ate together in the corner they'd claimed last night. Warren and Margaret and their 2 adult sons who'd ridden down from the homestead at first light when the storm broke following Gideon's tracks back. Margaret Calloway ate with the deliberate appreciation of a woman who'd been frightened the night before, and was now on the other side of it and intended to enjoy being there. She caught Marian's eye across the room and held it for a moment and gave a single small nod. Marian nodded back. Around 8, people began the complicated process of gathering children and blankets and sorting out whose coat had ended up in whose pile. The ordinary chaos of 30 people trying to leave the same building at the same time. Gideon had ridden out already with Pete. Cal was outside assessing the road conditions and helping people dig out their wagons from the drifts that had built up against the lee side of the building overnight. Ruth Payne found Marian near the kitchen doorway. She came with a purpose in her step that was different from yesterday's provisional tolerance, something more direct, the bearing of a woman who had made a decision and arrived to execute it. She stopped in front of Marian with her hands folded in front of her in the way she had when she was being careful and precise about something. "I want to say something," Ruth said. "All right, I was wrong about you." She said it cleanly, without decorating it with qualifications. Ruth Payne did not apologize carelessly, and she did not do it with extra words. "I had formed an opinion that was not fair, and last night made that clear to me, and I'd rather tell you so directly than have you hear something incomplete through other channels." Marian looked at her. "I appreciate that." "I'm not sure you should," Ruth said, with a dryness that surprised a short laugh out of Marian. "I was among the people whose opinion mattered in this town, and I didn't use it well. That has consequences for you, whether I intended them or not." "It did," Marian agreed, "but I've had worse." Ruth studied her with those sharp eyes. "Yes," she said slowly, "I imagine you have." A pause. "You wanted to speak to me about something." Marian had been organizing this idea in her head since September, when she'd first gone through Dolores Hartman's notes and seen the scope of what the valley lacked. She'd been waiting for the right time to bring it to someone who had the standing in this community to make it real. She'd been waiting, if she was honest, for the standing herself. "A cooperative storage system," she said, "for winter supplies. Not charity. A real cooperative where every family that can contribute does, according to what they actually have, and every family that needs draws from it according to what they actually need, with proper accounting. So the whole thing is transparent and no one feels like they're taking something they didn't earn." She watched Ruth's face as she said it. Last night there were 3 families in this hall who came with less than they should have had for winter. I'm not going to say their names, but I know which ones. And I know the ones who didn't know those families needed help because no one had built a system for them to know without it being anyone's shame. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "That's been needed for 10 years, she said. "I know. People have talked about it. Talking doesn't stock a root cellar." Something moved at the corner of Ruth's mouth that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "No, it doesn't." She looked at Marian with the expression of someone arriving at a conclusion they should have reached earlier. "You've already thought out how it would work. The basics. I'd need your knowledge of these families to make it right. Who would manage it fairly? Who would need to be part of it to lend it legitimacy? I can build the accounting structure. I can't tell you which 3 families in this valley have the trust that makes others willing to follow. I can tell you that." "I know you can," Marian said. "That's why I'm talking to you." Ruth Payne looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "Come to my house Thursday. Bring your figures. I'll be there." Ruth nodded and moved away with the purposeful efficiency of a woman who had just added an important item to her list and was already reorganizing the rest of the day around it. Marian watched her go with a feeling she took a moment to identify. It was not triumph, nothing as sharp-edged as that. It was more like the feeling of a door opening that had been stuck, not locked, the particular yield of something that only needed sustained, steady pressure to finally give. The hall emptied over the next 2 hours. People left in groups, the ones heading the same direction sorting out who would ride with whom in case the road had soft spots under the snow. Marian stood at the door and said goodbye to each family as they left, and something happened with each departure that she hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely prepared for. Clara Fisk, who'd cried against the wall the night before, hugged her. It was the abrupt, fierce hug of someone not given to display who's doing it anyway because the feeling is too large to hold in. She said into Marian's shoulder, "I was horrible to you at the dry goods store in September. I said something to Odell Fitch's wife." She pulled back. Her eyes were red. "I'm sorry." Marian didn't know what had been said. She didn't ask. "It's all right," she said, and meant it in the uncomplicated way, not as absolution, just as truth, The way you say the rain stopped rather than I forgive you for the rain. Clara nodded and left before she started crying again. Denny Oakes, the 19-year-old who'd come back from the road with snow on his hat and said nothing about it, stopped in the doorway with his coat on. He stood there for a second like he was going to walk through and then didn't. He turned around. "You were right," he said, "about the road. He looked like it cost him something." "I would have died out there. You would have been in serious trouble," she said. She didn't minimize it, but she didn't make it dramatic either. "You came back. That was the smart call." "I didn't come back because I was smart," he said. "I came back because the wind turned and I couldn't see the wagon tongue in front of me." He looked at the floor and then back up at her. "But I should have listened to you the first time." She nodded. He went. The last to leave was Agnes Toll, who helped Marian stack the folded blankets and sweep the hall floor in the particular quiet of two people doing a task together who don't need to fill the space with conversation. When they were done, Agnes said, "Are you all right?" Marian, who'd been awake for the better part of 20 hours and whose back had opinions about the church hall floor, said, "I'll be fine." "That's not what I asked." She looked at Agnes. The younger woman was watching her with the direct attention of someone who decided to actually look at another person rather than at the impression of them. It was, Marian thought, a rare quality. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm glad last night went the way it went and not the way it could have. And I have to go home and check on my stove." She picked up the last blanket. "But yes, I think I'm all right." Agnes smiled. It was a real one. "Good. Thursday at Ruth's. I'll be there too." She walked out into the snow and the light. Marian stood alone in the empty hall for a moment. The stove was burning down to embers now. The room smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and the specific human smell of a large group of people who'd spent a frightened night together and come out the other side. Slightly tired, slightly raw, and fundamentally intact. She put on her coat and went home. The ranch looked like it had been through a fight, which it had. Drifts up the north side of the barn nearly to the eaves, the fence line invisible under white, but the main house was standing solid, the way things stood when they'd been properly weatherproofed, and the smoke coming from the chimney told her Cal had gotten back before her and taken care of the stove. She stood in the yard for a moment and looked at the building, the peeling paint on the south wall she'd been planning to fix, the kitchen window she'd sealed with felt in the first week, the garden that was currently 4 feet under snow and would need clearing in spring. She thought, mine. Not for the first time, but for the first time without the question mark at the end of it. She went inside. Cal was at the kitchen table with his hands around a coffee cup and the look of a man who'd been awake too long and was running on the pure stubborn refusal to stop. He looked up when she came in. "Gideon's still out," he said. "He and Pete went to the Oaks place. Should be back before dark." "Good." She hung up her coat. "How's the barn?" "Fine. Some drift against the east side, but nothing got in." She poured herself coffee and sat down. They sat together in the comfortable silence they'd developed over 2 months, the silence of people who'd gotten past the part where silence was uncomfortable. After a while, Cal said, "People are going to talk different about you now." She looked at her coffee cup. "I know. Denny Oakes has got a mouth on him. He'll have told half the valley you saved his life before he even got his horse stabled. That's an exaggeration." "Don't matter if it's an exaggeration," Cal said. "It's the direction of the truth." He looked at her directly, which he didn't do often. He was a man who paid attention sideways, obliquely, without appearing to. "You did good last night, more than good." She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she just said, "So did you." He shrugged, looking away. Drank his coffee. That was the end of that conversation, which was precisely how it should be. Gideon came back at 4 in the afternoon with Pete, both of them worn down in the way of men who'd done hard physical work in deep snow for several hours. The Oaks cow was secured. The Brower sheep had gotten through the night in their barn without problem. 2 fence lines down, but nothing that couldn't wait until the snow settled. He came into the kitchen and poured coffee and stood at the counter drinking it while Marian finished the soup she'd been making since she got home. The kitchen was warm. The soup was not a refined dish. It was everything practical from the pantry, built for temperature and substance rather than elegance. But it smelled the way a kitchen was supposed to smell after a hard day. He said, after a while, "Ruth Payne stopped me on the road coming back." Marian looked up. "She was out already?" Ruth Payne waits for Weather to apologize to her, not the other way around. He said it without humor, just as a fact, and somehow that made it funnier than if he'd tried. She wanted me to know that she'd been speaking unfavorably about you to certain people, and she intended to correct that. Marian stirred the soup. She told me something similar this morning. Did she? He was quiet for a moment. Did it matter? Hearing it from her? She thought about it honestly. Less than I thought it would. More than I wanted it to. He was quiet again, in the considering way he had. Then, she said you talked to her about a cooperative supply system. I did. She seemed like she thought it was a good idea. I think it is a good idea. He set down his cup and turned to look at her fully, the direct, held attention he used when something had his complete focus. You're going to stay, he said. It wasn't entirely a question. She looked back at him. I told you in my letters that I wasn't someone who ran. You did. He picked up his cup again, looking at it. I didn't read those letters as carefully as I should have. She felt the weight of that sentence, what it cost him to say it, what it acknowledged. She thought about the man standing on the train platform with the recalculating look on his face. The man who'd spent 8 weeks slowly discovering that he'd been wrong not just about a person, but about the way he'd been evaluating people. You read them better as we went, she said. And that was true, and it was enough to say. He looked at her over the coffee cup with those November sky eyes and said nothing for a moment. The soup moved on the stove. The fire settled in the hearth. Outside, the light was going golden over the snow, the late afternoon color that turned the whole valley into something extraordinary that nobody had asked it to be. It just was. I have something I want to say to you, he said. She waited. He put the cup down. He wasn't a man who practiced speeches, and it showed. He had the expression of someone who knows what they mean and is finding the way to the words, which was actually more honest than facility would have been. When you came off that train, I made a judgment. I was wrong. And not just, I don't mean I was wrong about your ability to run the ranch or manage the books or any of the things you've done since you got here. I mean, I was wrong about what I was looking at, about what mattered. He stopped, seemed to decide this wasn't quite complete. I don't want this to be an arrangement anymore. She looked at him steadily. Something in her chest was doing the thing again. The slow opening, the warmth that she'd spent 31 years not trusting, because trusting it had always preceded its withdrawal. What do you want it to be? She asked. He looked directly at her. I want it to be real. The word landed simply, without elaboration. A man who'd spent 4 years not entirely living in his own house saying, with one word, that he was ready to try again. She thought about the carpet bag, the $22 in her boot, the matrimonial correspondence office of St. Louis, and the 4 cramped handwriting letters and the decision she'd made to get on a train heading west, because it was either that or admit that everything she was would always be a practical asset and never anything else. She thought about 23 years of being sensible-looking and capable and useful, all those words that people used when they couldn't use wanted. She thought about the church hall last night, Clara Fisk's arms around her, Denny Oakes in the doorway, Agnes Toll asking, "Are you all right?" with eyes that actually wanted to know the answer. Ruth Payne's clean, uncomplicated apology. Warren Calloway shaking when he held his wife. Margaret Calloway's nod across the room. She thought about this kitchen at 4:30 in the morning on her first day here, and the sound the draft stopped making when she pressed the felt into the window frame, and the particular satisfaction of a room that functions the way it's supposed to function. She said, "So do I." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a flood of long-suppressed sentiment or a tearful accounting of what she'd felt, and hidden and protected. It was just the truth, said plainly, by a woman who'd spent a long time waiting for a place where the truth was enough. He crossed the kitchen. He was not a graceful man. He moved the way he did most things, with a directness that didn't waste motion. And he stopped in front of her and put both hands on the sides of her face and held it the way you hold something you've realized is more important than you knew. She let him. That was the most significant thing. She let him. The soup nearly burned. She caught it in time, pulling back to grab the handle and move the pot, and he stepped aside to let her. And they looked at each other, and something broke open that was not in the crying sense, but in the sense of pressure releasing. The specific relief of two people who have been living carefully alongside each other, finally deciding to stop. "The soup," she said. "I see that," he said. She turned back to the stove. He stood behind her, not touching, just present, and that was somehow right. The fact that they could be in the same room with the ordinary work of living happening between them, and it didn't need to stop or be set aside to make space for the feeling. The feeling and the soup could coexist. That was, she thought, what real felt like. Not an interruption of the everyday, but the everyday itself, inhabited differently. The weeks after the blizzard had a different texture. It wasn't immediate. Nothing in real life changes in a single dramatic morning, despite what the story of the morning would imply. Pete Marsh still occasionally did things that were maddening. He had the specific ability of an otherwise decent man to hear instructions and then perform a slightly different version of them that somehow negated the entire point, and this did not change because Marian had saved 30 people's lives in a blizzard. Cal was still Cal, paying his sideways attention and saying little, though the little he said had shifted slightly in its register, become less guarded. The ranch still had a leaking spot in the barn roof that everyone had been avoiding thinking about. The accounting for November was complicated by the storm damage, and Marian spent 3 evenings on it that she would have rather spent on something else. But things were different. In town, the change was the most visible. She felt it the first time she went to Millhaven's main street a week after the storm. The way people greeted her, the quality of the greetings, the specific difference between being tolerated and being acknowledged. Odell Fitch came from behind the counter to speak to her instead of waiting for her to come to him. 3 women she'd barely exchanged words with stopped her on the street to ask how the road was clearing and stayed to talk longer than that required. Denny Oakes, across the street, saw her and raised his hat in a gesture that carried something more than ordinary politeness in it. Ruth Payne's Thursday meeting became a regular thing. By the second meeting, it had 6 women. By the third, it had 8, including Dolores Hartman, whose collarbone was healing and who arrived with her own green ledger and spent the first 20 minutes being told by Ruth what Marian had done with the harvest gathering, listening with the attentive expression of a woman who was hearing something she was going to think about for a long time. After the meeting, Dolores caught Marian at the door. "You used my notes," she said. "They were good notes," Marian said. "The discretion system. For the families that needed it, without it being visible. That was yours. I just built around it." Dolores looked at her for a moment. She was perhaps 50, a square-jawed, efficient woman who had clearly been doing important work in this valley for a long time, and had never needed anyone to tell her so. "Come to supper next week," she said. "I want to talk to you about the storage system, and about next year's gathering." "I'll come," Marian said. The cooperative plan moved slowly, which was appropriate. You didn't ask frontier families to pool resources on a Tuesday morning and expect them to show up with grain by Thursday. You built trust first, and trust in a small isolated community was built by being present and consistent over time, by saying what you would do and then doing it, by not asking for anything you weren't willing to give. Marian understood this. She had spent her whole life building trust in places where no one had given her the benefit of the doubt. She and Ruth spent the early winter outlining the structure, how contributions would be assessed, how the accounting would work, who would hold the reserve and who would verify it. She built the ledger system herself, designed so that any literate person could audit it without needing to understand bookkeeping, which was important because you didn't want a system that could only be managed by the person who built it. Systems like that were too easy to walk away from, and she had no intention of always being here to run it. She intended to build something that worked whether or not she was around to tend it. Gideon watched this work the way he'd watched everything she did, steadily, from a slight distance that was no longer the distance of reservation, but of a particular kind of respect. The respect that lets something proceed without interruption because it's going exactly the way it should. He said little about it directly. But he came home one evening to find Ruth Payne and Dolores Hartman and 2 other women at his kitchen table with papers spread everywhere and coffee going. And instead of retreating, he put his coat back on and went to check on the horses and gave them the room for another hour without being asked. She told him later, when everyone had gone, "You didn't have to leave." "I know," he said, "but you were working." She looked at him across the kitchen in the lamplight. He was a difficult man in some ways, not easy to read, not easy to reach, with the closed-off quality of someone who'd learned to be alone and had built efficient systems around it. He still sometimes went silent for long stretches that she had to learn not to interpret as withdrawal from her specifically. He was, she thought, not the kind of man you finished understanding. He was the kind you kept on understanding, a little more each year. She could work with that. The cooperative's first real test will be February, she said. If we can get 8 families signed on before Christmas. You'll get 10, he said. You don't know that. No, he agreed. But I know you. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, without ornamentation, just fact. 8 weeks you fixed this ranch. You saved 30 people in a blizzard. You got Ruth Payne to admit she was wrong about something. He poured himself coffee. 10 families by Christmas. She looked at him with the feeling she'd spent 31 years not quite daring to inhabit. It was not comfortable, that feeling. It wasn't supposed to be, she thought. Comfort was easy. This was something with weight to it, something that required you to be present rather than just nearby. 11, she said, if we include the Calloway family. He looked at her over his coffee cup. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something better than a smile. The specific expression of a man who is, for the first time in a long time, at ease in his own life. 11, he agreed. Outside, the snow was settling into the deep quiet of a Colorado winter night. The ranch sat under it, solid and functioning. Every problem inside it a known quantity with a plan attached. The barn was weatherproof. The accounts were in order. The pantry was stocked by a system that anyone could follow. In the spring, there would be fence lines to repair, and a roof to fix, and a garden to clear and plant again, and a valley to pull through winter with a little more coordination than it had managed before. But tonight the stove was burning well, and the lamp was lit, and 2 people who had arrived at each other sideways through letters and suspicion and 8 weeks of watching were sitting in a kitchen that had stopped being a practical arrangement and become something neither of them had quite let themselves expect. It was, Marian thought, enough. More than enough. It was a beginning. 11 families signed onto the cooperative before Christmas. Gideon had been right, which she did not tell him directly, but which he understood from the way she came home from the December meeting with Ruth and set her coat down and said, without preamble, 12, actually. The Fenner family asked to join at the end. He was at the table cleaning a bridle, and he looked up with that almost expression that lived in the corner of his mouth. 12. Don't say anything. I wasn't going to say anything. She sat down across from him and opened her ledger, and they stayed like that for an hour, each doing their own work in the same room, the lamp between them, the stove keeping the cold at honest distance. It was ordinary. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, 2 people occupying the same space in the quiet rhythm of a shared life. And Marian felt the ordinariness of it with a precision that was almost painful, the way you feel something most when you've spent a long time not having it. Christmas came and went without ceremony. They were not a ceremonial household. Cal and Pete ate supper with them on Christmas evening, and Marian made a venison pie from the last of the Calloway smoked meat, and Pete Marsh, who had been an enigma for 3 months, a man of few words and fewer visible feelings, produced a small bottle of whiskey from somewhere and poured 4 glasses without asking anyone if they wanted one. Which was, she'd learned, Pete's way of doing most things. Not asking, just doing, and trusting the people around him to accept or not. She accepted. It was rough whiskey, and she didn't pretend otherwise, and Pete looked almost visibly relieved that she didn't pretend otherwise. To the ranch, Cal said, lifting his glass. To the ranch, Gideon said. Marian lifted hers. She thought about what to add. She thought about October, about the train platform, about the carpet bag between her boots, and the $22 in her left boot, and the recalculating look on a man's face at a distance of 20 feet. To next year, she said. They drank. January was hard the way Colorado. January always was, not dramatically, not with the sudden violence of the November blizzard, but with the grinding persistence of cold that settles in and intends to stay. The kind of cold that finds every gap you missed, every place where the weatherproofing was almost good enough, but not entirely. The ranch handled it better than it had in years, she could tell from the supply numbers, from the firewood that was going slower than it should have because the drafts were gone from most of the rooms now. The cooperative had its first real test in January, and it was not the test she'd planned for. A family named Breslin, a young couple, married 2 years, with a 4-month-old infant, had their root cellar flood when an underground seep they hadn't known about finally broke through under the weight of the frozen soil shifting. 3 weeks of stored food gone in a night, not spoiled, destroyed, the preserved jars broken, the dried stores soaked through and growing mold within 48 hours. Thomas Breslin came to Marian on a Wednesday morning with his hat in his hands and the specific expression of a young man who has never had to ask for help before and does not know the correct posture for it. He was 24, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who'd been told since he was old enough to work that a man who couldn't provide for his own family had failed at the fundamental thing. He stood on the porch of the Hale Ranch and said, "I heard about the cooperative. We were planning to join in the spring when we had more to put in. We didn't think." He stopped, looked at his hat. "We need help." "I don't know how else to say it." Marian looked at him for a moment. She thought about the accounting structure she'd built, about the clause she'd included that Ruth had initially questioned, the emergency provision, the draw for families who hadn't yet contributed, to be repaid in kind over the following 2 years without interest, and without it being anyone's business outside the people who held the books. She'd put it in because she knew that the families who needed help most urgently were also the families least likely to have planned far enough ahead to be part of a cooperative before the crisis arrived. Ruth had called it a risk. Marian had said, "It's the whole point." She had Thomas Breslin sit at her kitchen table while she opened the ledger and walked him through the numbers. What the cooperative held, what his family needed for the next 6 weeks, how the repayment would work, what he would need to bring in the spring to settle the account. She made it matter of fact, not transactional and not charitable, just the plain arithmetic of a system designed to work both ways. He sat across from her and listened, and at the end of it he said, I thought it would be more complicated." "It's a ledger," Marian said. "Most things that work are straightforward." He looked at her with his young face and his scraped clean pride and said, "Mrs. Hale, Miss Ashcroft," she said. Old habit, almost automatic. He nodded slowly. "Why did you build this?" "The cooperative. You've only been here since October." She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I've needed it before," she said. "The equivalent of it. And it didn't exist. And I thought if I was going to be somewhere for a long time, it ought to exist." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and put on his hat. "Thank you," he said, and went out. She sat at the kitchen table after the door closed and looked at the ledger. 12 families, and now 13 with the Breslins. The numbers were holding. The reserve was right. Thomas Breslin would go home with enough to get his family through February, and in April he'd bring a contribution that would make the cooperative stronger than it was before he needed it. That was how it was supposed to work. She thought, this is what I came here for. Not the specific thing, not the Breslin family in particular, but this, the feeling of a system doing what it was built to do, of foresight made concrete, of something she'd built holding weight it was asked to hold. She got up and put the coffee on, because there was still the afternoon to get through, and she'd learned not to sit with completed feelings for longer than they required. February brought Dolores Hartman back to full capacity, collarbone healed, opinion reformed, and a remarkable desire to reorganize the harvest gathering planning process based on what Marian had done in October. She arrived at the Thursday meeting with a rewritten version of her green ledger and spent 45 minutes going through the changes she intended to make, occasionally looking at Marian to check whether she'd missed anything Marian had improved on. It was, Marian thought, one of the more unusual experiences of her life. Watching a competent woman systematically incorporate another woman's improvements into her own system, not resentfully, but with the focused interest of someone who cares more about the outcome than who gets credit for the process. After the meeting, walking back through the February cold with Ruth, Marian said, "Dolores doesn't mind that I change things." "Dolores minds when things are wrong," Ruth said. "She doesn't mind when they're right." She paused. "She's better at that than most people, than most women, particularly. We have a complicated relationship with being improved upon." It was the most personal thing Ruth Payne had ever said to her. Marian let it land without making anything of it. "So do I," she said. "I'm working on it." Ruth glanced at her sideways. There was, in that glance, something that had not been present in October. Something that had no good name but that functioned like the particular regard between two women who understand each other. Not completely, not without continued work, but enough to proceed. They walked the rest of the way in the cold silence that had become companionable by degrees. March brought mud season, which was its own particular misery. The snow going to slush, the roads going to something that ate wagon wheels, the whole valley in the raw transition state between winter's clean severity and spring's eventual recovery. The ranch was a constant losing battle against mud for 6 weeks. Cal fixed the fence line that had gone down in the blizzard. Pete fixed the barn roof finally. With lumber Gideon brought from the Millhaven mill on a dry day when the road permitted it. Marian planted the kitchen garden in stages, starting the earliest cold-tolerant varieties under cloth frames she'd constructed over the winter and read about in a farming almanac she'd ordered from Denver in January. This was experimental. She wasn't certain it would work at this altitude, and she said so to Gideon when she was doing it. He watched her install the frames with the expression he wore when he was learning something and not advertising it. "Have you done that before?" he said. "No, but the theory is sound." She pressed the last frame into the mud. "Worst case, I lose 6 weeks. Best case, we have early greens in April, and the household isn't buying dried things we don't need to buy. And if the frames don't hold the cold, then I'll have information I didn't have before." He looked at her. "Most people don't phrase failure that way." "Most people waste it," she said, and picked up her tools and went back to the house. The frames held. By mid-April, she had lettuce and young spinach coming in under the cloth, and the look on Cal's face when she put fresh salad on the supper table in late April, the look of a man who hadn't expected fresh greens before June and was recalibrating his understanding of what was possible, was one of the small, private satisfactions of a kind that nobody around her entirely understood, and she'd stopped expecting them to. It was April when Gideon asked her to marry him. It did not happen the way things happen in stories. There was no prepared speech, no obvious moment built toward. They were in the barn, of all places, because a calf had been born that morning, and Marian had been helping because the situation required more than 2 hands, and the ranch hand, who should have been there, had ridden to Millhaven for supplies. She was not clean, she was not composed. She was tired, and there was mud on her coat, and the calf was fine, and she was standing in the barn doorway watching the new mother settle and feeling the particular quiet aftermath of something difficult that had gone right. Gideon was beside her. He'd been doing the same work and was in similar condition. He said, without looking at her, "I'd like to make this official." She looked at the side of his face. "The calf?" "Us." He turned to look at her then, directly, the way he looked at her when he meant something with his whole attention. "I'd like to marry you. I know I'm not asking in the way that's usually done. I don't have a ring yet. I was going to do this differently, but I don't see the point in waiting for a better moment when this one seems like plenty." She looked at him for a long time. He was, she thought, the most honest man she'd ever met. In the particular way of people who aren't honest because it's virtuous, but because they can't see the utility in being otherwise. He was difficult sometimes, and simple sometimes, and wrong about things sometimes, and she expected this to continue. He had silences that were still occasionally hard to read, and opinions that were sometimes more stubborn than the evidence warranted, and a relationship with expressing feeling that had years of work left in it. She thought about the St. Louis matrimonial correspondence office and the letters in the train. She thought, "I came out here because I was practical and I had nothing left to lose. And what I found instead was this." "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that was not quite as steady as he probably wanted it to be. "Good," he said. The calf made a sound from somewhere behind them. The mare shifted in her stall. Outside, the April mud was drying in patches, and the earliest of the garden was doing what it was supposed to do, and somewhere out past the ridge the valley was going green. She said, "You still owe me a ring." He looked at her, the corner of his mouth. "I know." They were married in the last week of May, when the valley had finally decided on spring and held to it. The ceremony was at the Ironcrest Church, simple and brief, because neither of them had any patience for elaborate performance of something that was already real. Ruth Payne organized the gathering afterward. She did this without being asked, appearing one morning with a list of what she intended to arrange, and going through it as if seeking Marian's approval, which she was not. She was informing her. Marian recognized the dynamic and accepted it for what it was, which was Ruth Payne's way of participating in something she cared about. That was worth more than the form. Cal Dreyer came in his good shirt, which Marian hadn't known he owned. Pete Marsh came in his, which she also hadn't known he owned, and stood at the back of the church with the expression of a man who'd been wrong about something fundamental and had been sitting with that knowledge for 6 months and had used the time productively. The Calloway family came, all of them, Warren and Margaret in the front row, Margaret in a blue dress she'd brought from somewhere, sitting straight with the bearing of a woman who attended an event she considers important. When Marian caught Margaret's eye before the ceremony, Margaret gave her the same single deliberate nod she'd given across the church hall the morning after the blizzard. Marian held it for a moment. Agnes Toll cried, which startled no one who knew Agnes. Dolores Hartman did not cry, but she pressed Marian's hand hard when she passed her in the entry and didn't say anything, which meant more than most things people said. The gathering afterward was at the ranch, because it was May, and the yard was dry and the garden was visible from the tables, and Marian had wanted it there, in the place that had been the first project and was still the most visible evidence of 8 months of work. She'd spent 2 days cooking alongside Agnes and a woman named Sarah Brower, Thomas Breslin's neighbor, who'd shown up Wednesday morning and said she was helping and had in fact been more help than anyone had asked for. Thomas Breslin was there with his wife and their infant daughter, who was now 7 months old and had survived the winter in good health. He raised his glass to Marian across the yard at one point, a simple gesture, nothing said. She raised hers back. Gideon stood beside her through most of the afternoon, not making speeches, not performing the event for the audience, just there. Present in the way she'd come to understand was his particular expression of care, showing up and staying. She thought she'd probably spend the next 20 years learning the other ways he showed it, and thought this without resentment, because learning something over 20 years meant you had 20 years. Toward the end of the afternoon, she slipped away from the gathering for a few minutes. She went inside, through the kitchen, into the small room off the main hall where she'd been sleeping in October, the room she'd carried her carpet bag into, and sat on the edge of the bed for 30 seconds before getting up to start working. The room was different now, but not transformed, not unrecognizable, still the same dimensions with the same west-facing window, but inhabited differently. There were things in it that were hers. The stack of almanacs and accounting books on the shelf she'd asked Gideon to build in January. A piece of fabric she'd been meaning to make into curtains and hadn't gotten to yet. Her good coat on the hook she'd added to the back of the door. The carpet bag was on the top shelf, pushed back. She hadn't looked at it in months. She reached up and took it down and held it for a moment. It was lighter than she remembered. She'd removed everything from it in October and distributed the contents to their proper places. So all it held now was its own empty structure, a little collapsed, the leather of the handle worn smooth in the particular place where her hand had carried it for years. She thought about the woman who'd held this bag on a train out of St. Louis with $22 in her boot and a letter of introduction and no particular plan beyond arriving and making herself useful. She thought about the word practical and all the years she'd heard it as a consolation, a lesser category. The word you used when wanted was not on offer. She turned the bag over in her hands. The thing about practical was this. It lasted. Beautiful faded, charming wore thin, performance exhausted itself. But the woman who could read a room and understand what it needed and fix the thing that was broken, that woman was still there in the morning. Still there in February when the root cellar flooded and a young man came with his hat in his hands. Still there in the November dark when the weather changed and 30 families needed someone to make a decision. She had spent 31 years treating practical like a consolation prize. She thought now that she'd had it wrong. She'd been looking at the thing upside down, in the way you sometimes can't see a shape until someone points out the negative space. What she was, the thing that had always been dismissed as lesser, as not beautiful enough, as sensible instead of something better, was precisely the thing this valley had needed, not in spite of its ordinariness, because of it. She put the bag back on the shelf. She stood at the west window for a moment. The afternoon light was doing its Colorado thing, turning the ridge gold above the shadow line, painting the valley in the specific unreasonable beauty of a high-altitude May evening. The sound of the gathering came through the walls, voices, a child's laugh, the particular sound of a group of people who are comfortable with each other in a place they share. She thought, this is mine. Not the way she'd thought it in January, with the question mark that was more hope than conviction. just the plain statement of a truth that had stopped needing to be argued. She went back outside. Gideon was talking to Warren Calloway when she came around the corner of the house, and he looked up and found her immediately in the way he'd started doing. Not searching, just locating, the reflex of a man who had learned to track where someone was because he wanted to know. He said something to Warren and crossed the yard toward her. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She looked at the gathering, her valley, the people who had become hers by degrees, by work, by the accumulation of small, true things. "I'm all right." He stood beside her and looked at the same thing. He had his coffee cup and his worn jacket, and the gray coming in more at his temples than it had in October, and she thought there was a particular intimacy in noticing how someone was aging and being close enough over time that you could see it, not as loss but as presence, as evidence of time shared. "Next winter," she said, "I want to expand the cooperative to include the settlements past Miller's Creek, the ones that had no representation at the harvest gathering because the road's too unreliable. If we can get a secondary storage point established on the east side of the canyon, Marian—" She stopped. He was looking at her with the expression that lived in his face when he was about to say something he'd been thinking about for a while. "It's our wedding day," he said. She looked at him. "I know. The cooperative can wait until tomorrow." "I'm not saying it can't." She turned to face him fully. "I was just thinking aloud." "I know you were." He looked at her steadily. "You're always thinking 3 seasons ahead. I've gotten used to it." The corner of his mouth. "I'm saying that for approximately the next 2 hours, maybe try thinking about this one." She held his gaze. Outside, the late light was going warm and long across the yard. The garden was coming in the way she'd planned it. The barn roof was fixed. The accounts were in order. The valley had 13 cooperating families heading into their second season more prepared than they'd begun. Cal was laughing at something across the yard, which she'd never heard him do before, a real laugh, full and unguarded. Pete Marsh was talking to Thomas Breslin with the easy posture of men who found common ground. There would be next winter and the winter after, and the settlements past Miller's Creek, and new problems she hadn't encountered yet and couldn't plan for, and that was all right. That was what a life looked like from the inside. Not resolved, not complete, but ongoing, with more room in it than she'd ever let herself expect. She looked at Gideon Hale, who had stood on a train platform in October and recalculated and spent 8 weeks being slowly, thoroughly, irrevocably wrong about her. Who had said, "I want it to be real" with one word and meant it in all the ways that mattered. Who had learned to ask, "What do you need?" and to mean it as a question and not a performance of helpfulness. She took his hand. It was not a practice gesture from either of them. They were both people who lived in their heads more than their hands, who expressed things sideways, who'd spent long years managing on their own and carried the habits of it. The hand-holding was slightly awkward in the way of two people who are going to get better at this over time. She didn't let go. 2 hours, she said. He looked at her with his whole face, the way he'd been slowly learning to do over 8 months, the guardedness giving ground by degrees to something more open. 2 hours, he agreed. They stood together in the last of the May afternoon, in the yard of a ranch that worked, in the valley that was changing because someone had refused to give up in it, and the sounds of a community that had found its way to something better came from all around them, ordinary and alive. The woman nobody wanted had become the quiet center of something real, not because the valley had finally seen her worth, though it had, but because she had never stopped building, even when no one was watching, even when no one believed it would amount to anything. She had built practical things, a pantry system, an accounting ledger, a cooperative that would outlast her personal attention, a garden that came in early. And from those practical things, without intending it, without performing it, she had built a life. That was the whole of the story, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.